The war around Iran has done something the world has feared for decades. It has pushed the Strait of Hormuz back to the center of global crisis.
Strait of Hormuz.
President Trump asked the chairman of the Joint Chiefs why they can't just immediately reopen the Strait of Hormuz.
It's one of the many countries hoping the U.S. can reopen the nearby Strait of Hormuz.
This narrow passage carries about 1/5 of the world's oil, and once fighting threatens that route, the shock spreads far beyond the Middle East. Oil prices jump, shipping stalls, and governments panic. The danger is easy to see. The difficult question comes after that. If this strait is such a fragile choke point, what kind of solution could finally reduce the world's dependence on it? To understand why this matters so much, you have to start with the countries on both sides of the problem. Iran sits on the northern side of the Strait of Hormuz. Across the water are Oman and the UAE. Behind the strait sits the Persian Gulf, where Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and the UAE produce and load huge volumes of oil and gas for the rest of the world. That makes Hormuz less like a normal sea lane and more like a gate. If the gate is threatened, the cargo behind it is suddenly trapped by geography. In 2024, oil flow through the strait averaged about 20 million barrels per day, equal to roughly 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption. In March 2026, the IEA said flows had plunged from around 20 million barrels per day before the war to only a trickle. That is what makes this place different from areas like the Panama Canal. But how? Simply, Panama is a shortcut, while Hormuz is an exit. If Panama runs into trouble, ships can still sail around South America. It is slower and more expensive, but the ocean is still open. Hormuz works differently. A tanker loaded inside the Gulf cannot simply choose another sea route once this passage is blocked. That is why every crisis here feels bigger than the map suggests. The world is not reacting to a narrow stretch of water. It is reacting to the risk of losing access to one of its most important energy basins. That is also why Saudi Arabia matters so much in this story. Saudi is one of the biggest oil producers on Earth, but a large share of its crude is produced on the Gulf side. Under normal conditions, Hormuz remains the most direct maritime route out to global markets. Saudi Arabia did plan for danger years ago. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, the kingdom built its east-west pipeline across its own territory to the Red Sea. That line gave Saudi Arabia a partial escape route that avoided Hormuz completely. The IEA says the system still provides between 3 and 5 million barrels per day of spare capacity in early 2026, depending on operating conditions and export capacity on the West Coast. That sounds like a major safety valve, and it is, but it still does not solve the full problem. Even when Saudi pushes more crude westward, there are still port limits, tanker logistics, and another strategic problem farther south. Any ship leaving the Red Sea on its way to Asia must still pass through Bab el-Mandeb, another exposed choke point. But how does Iran factor into this at this point? Iran is a country that gives the strait its strategic edge. Iran does not need to occupy the whole Gulf to threaten global trade. Its position alone gives it leverage. The strait is narrow, heavily watched, and easy to disrupt, compared with the amount of commerce that depends on it. Recent reporting shows that since the war escalated in late February 2026, Iran has used that leverage to squeeze traffic, while some vessels have still crossed under limited or selective conditions. Reports in April of 2026 indicated that intelligence assessments did not expect a quick easing, even as some Japanese, French, Omani, and Iraqi-linked vessels managed to pass. That selective movement makes the situation even more dangerous, especially given the threats coming out of the White House. For Washington, Hormuz is tied to global energy stability, naval power, and the balance of power in the Middle East. Reports noted in March 2026 that crude prices had risen sharply as petroleum shipments through Hormuz fell and some Middle East production shut in. The war has already forced governments and energy producers to think in emergency terms rather than long-term planning. And that leads to the real weakness at the center of this system. The world knew Hormuz was fragile. It knew this before 2026. It knew it in the 1980s. It knew it during later nuclear standoffs with Iran. It knew it every time the region heated up. But instead of building a true replacement, most countries relied on a mix of hope, partial workarounds, and the assumption that the route would remain open enough for business to continue. The current crisis has exposed just how thin that assumption was. So, if pipelines cannot fully replace Hormuz, and if war can turn the strait into a pressure point for the whole world, then the obvious question follows. What kind of infrastructure could do what Panama did? What kind of project could cut through geography and create another exit? This is where the canal idea comes in. For years, engineers, planners, and strategists have returned to one dramatic concept, which is to build a man-made waterway from the Persian Gulf to open water beyond the Strait of Hormuz. In the most discussed versions, the canal would head toward the UAE's eastern coast near Fujairah, which already matters because it sits outside the strait. Other concepts have looked at Musandam, or much longer routes across the Arabian Peninsula. The basic logic stays the same in every version. If one choke point holds too much power, create another path around it. This is where the comparison to the Panama Canal becomes powerful. The Panama Canal changed global trade by cutting through land and eliminating a long, dangerous detour around South America. A Gulf bypass canal would try to do something similar for energy. It would save time and create resilience. This would also give tankers a second maritime exit from the Gulf, which means the world would no longer be held hostage by one narrow strip of water every time the region enters crisis. But the reason it still has not been built is simple. The idea is brilliant, and the reality is brutal. Between the Gulf and the Arabian Sea lies the Hajar mountain system. That means a bypass canal in the UAE-Oman corridor would likely face hard rock, steep terrain, heavy excavation, deep dredging, and probably a major lock system if the route crosses high ground. Older proposals discussed costs in the tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars. That is why the idea keeps coming back in times of fear, then fading when the crisis cools. Once the immediate panic passes, leaders look at the price and step back. And engineering is only half the problem. A canal here would also be political. It would raise questions over sovereignty, security, transit control, and who pays for a project designed to reshape one of the most sensitive energy regions in the world. That is why the canal remains one of those ideas that feels obvious in a crisis and impossible in a budget meeting. So how would this canal help solve global oil shortages? By doing one thing the current system fails to do, giving the Gulf a second sea exit. Right now, when Hormuz is squeezed, too much of the world's oil supply is forced into a bottleneck. Pipelines help, but not enough. Railways help with trade, but not crude at Hormuz scale. A canal would be different because it would move tankers, which means it would address the real transport problem at its source. It would not eliminate every risk in the region, but it would stop one narrow passage from carrying so much of the burden alone. That is why the canal idea is so attractive. It tackles the geography itself.